And what I want to do on the lesson is really continue on the lessons from Matthew. And so we're going to be talking about Jesus, but it's not about the birth of Jesus. This is beginning the day in which he was crucified. And we're going to be looking at the trial before Caiaphas. And so you might want to turn to Matthew 26, 57 through 68. Back in the traditions of men, there is a connection between this and December 25th. You wonder, how did we ever get December 25th as the birthday of Jesus? Well, that's not in the Bible. That's by men. And there were all these pagan festivals at that time, and it's kind of like a lot of Christians think, we ought to have us a celebration at this time that's different than these, and kind of pull people away from paganism. And we can question the judgment of that and even the rightness of that, I understand. But in doing all that, someone came up with the idea that when the Holy Spirit came on Mary and Christ was conceived in her womb, that happened according to the calendar now, the same calendar day that Jesus was crucified. Well, the Bible doesn't say that. But if you take that, since we know when that was, based on the time of Passover and all, and add about 9 months to it, it lands us here at December 25th. Well, that's kind of a thin connection, isn't it? And so it's based on a lot of legend and interpretations of men, and I just think it's kind of interesting to pursue that. Let's see what the Bible says about his trial before Caiaphas. I'm going to read it, and then we'll go back over it, and we're going to learn something about Jesus today that to me really gets to my heart. And so let's read this. And they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him afar off into the high priest's palace, and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priest and the elders and all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet they found none. At the last came 2 false witnesses and said, This fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said unto him, Thou sayest, thou hast said. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? And they answered and said, He is guilty of death. Then did they spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ. Who is he that smote thee? Well, that's where we're going to stop. Let's go back and look at this. They led him to Caiaphas the high priest. Matthew doesn't tell us this. In other accounts we read that first they led him to Annas the high priest. Now Annas had been the high priest years ago, and he was quite respected as a high priest, but now Annas is an old man. And yet though he is an old man, he's still pretty much in charge. He's the one that pulls the strings. He's very politically connected. And so they go by Annas first. Look, if we get this by Annas, the rest of the thing is just formal. We can deal with this. So they took him from Annas to Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the son-in-law of Annas. The reason he is high priest is because Annas had pulled the string, get his son-in-law in that position, see? And so they bring him to Caiaphas, the high priest. And it says the scribes and the elders were assembled. What were they doing assembled at Caiaphas' house? Well, you remember we read about how they arrested Jesus by night and brought him to Jerusalem? They knew what they were doing. This was all worked out in their minds. And so Caiaphas had already called the scribes and the elders and the council over to his house. They knew Jesus was coming, and they were going to try him right there and get this done with. And so they were waiting on him when he came. Now, there were laws. Rome is really known in ancient history as an empire that was governed by law. Well, the Jews had laws too. In fact, the Jews thought their laws were better than Romans' laws. And the Romans kind of backed off the Jews to a great extent, let the Jews govern themselves by their own law. Now, some of these laws are not spelled out in the Scriptures. But we know what those laws were. They had those laws all written down, and we know how they conducted trials. And so this is a Jewish trial. Now, here's some of the laws that the Jews had when they conducted trials. Proceeding against a man charged with a capital offense had to be conducted in public. That was their own law. All such proceedings were to be held in the temple. No proceedings were to be held at night. No convictions of death could be concluded in one day. As presiding judge, the high priest was at all times to assume an attitude of impartiality. The defendant was not to be placed under oath and was not required to testify against himself. And then this one's kind of peculiar. A unanimous verdict of guilty was suspect of conspiracy. Therefore, in such cases, the defendant was acquitted. I mean, if they all said he was guilty, he got off. Because they thought that just looks like conspiracy for everyone to agree here on this. So, isn't that a peculiar little law? Well, regardless, they laid all this aside when they came to try Jesus. And it was really not so much of a trial. He was not charged. They were like a grand jury seeking charges against him. They were not trying him against a charge when he came to Caiaphas. They didn't have a charge, and that's why they went to the false witness. Can you come up with a charge? Help us. Well, they laid hold on Jesus, carried him away to the scribes and to the high priest's palace. Now that is not the temple, was it? See? And so they're trying him here in a private residence and not out in public, as their law said they were supposed to do. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council saw false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death. This was not a fair trial. This was more like a lynch mob. They're looking for something to justify the outcome they've already decided on. It must have frustrated them as these witnesses came forward one after another, and they're trying to have some pretense of legal proceedings here, and they can't find any false witnesses that agree with each other. They all come up with different things and they're not agreeing. How frustrating that must have been. They found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet they found none. That means one false witness would tell one thing and another false witness will tell, well, those don't agree. I tell you, truth always agrees. Truth always agrees with all other truth. Well, you get out in this lie territory, and it's hard to find anything that matches up. And that's where they were. They were looking for lies. They were not looking for the truth. And that's why they were having so much trouble with this. Now, two came. They finally found two. The old law of Moses said at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. Now here it is by 2. They couldn't find 3. By the very thinnest line of evidence, they are ready to convict him. If they can just get 2 now. And these 2 are false witnesses. Here's what they said. This fella said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. Well, what if he said that? You know, there's no way he could do that. I mean, the whole thing sounds absurd, doesn't it? That's what they're going to charge him with for saying something like that? But the other thing is, he never said it. Now, Jesus never said that. They are wresting his words. He said something similar to this. Notice, I'm able to destroy the temple of God. Now, that's not what he said. Here's what he said. We find it over in John. It's in John chapter 2, verses 19 through 21. And this had been 2 or 3 years ago when he had said this. They're just now getting around to this. But here's what Jesus said. Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple. Look how I'm gesturing. That's what he's talking about. Now, I don't know if Jesus pointed to himself or not, but that's what he's talking about, because watch what it says. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building. Wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. Jesus is talking about his flesh. The temple wherein his spirit dwelt was that physical body. He was the Son of Man. In spirit, he was the Son of God. And so you destroy this body. 3 days I'll raise it up. He's talking about his resurrection. And not the temple that Herod had built them. But they wrested his words, and they got two of them to agree to say he'd said something that he had never said. And the high priest arose and said unto him, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? And Jesus held his peace. You know, sometimes things are just so absurd that silence can speak louder than words. Why should Jesus even have to answer such absurd, ridiculous charges? And in my mind's eye, I can just see that high priest and that council, just their frustration just growing. He won't even say anything. And they're trying their best to entice him by his words. And his very silence shows just how ridiculous they are being. So here's what the high priest did. The high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God. You know what that high priest is doing? He is breaking their own law. You're not supposed to put the defendant under an oath. And there he goes. I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. You know what they're doing? They're trying to require him to testify against himself, when their own law said they weren't supposed to do that. So he put him under oath to testify against himself. You know, it says in Isaiah that his judgment was taken away. Now, sometimes read that, you might think, I know people that their judgment passes, they don't make good judgments anymore. Maybe their minds become such that they can't think straight. That's not what this is talking about. They're talking about the justice that was due to him was taken away from him. That's the judgment that's taken away. And that's what this high priest is doing, an unjust judge, taking judgment away from him. So Jesus answered. Now, the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said unto him, thou hast said it. It's like we might say, you said it. Somebody said that. Well, you said it. We know what that means. You're answering in the affirmative, aren't you? You're saying, yes, I am the Christ, the Son of God. Matthew records this as well. That's Matthew. Mark records this as well. And Mark interprets that for us. See, Matthew's writing to Jews. They know what they meant. That's the way the Jews spoke with one another. Mark's probably writing to some Gentile Romans or something. Let me explain what Jesus says here. When he said, thou hast said, here's what Jesus meant. Again, the high priest asking and said unto him, art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. See, there's no question. Jesus is answering in the affirmative. Matthew giving us his words, and Mark explaining the significance of the words that Jesus spoke. But then Jesus said something else, and they weren't ready for this. And I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds of heaven. Well, he's talking about himself, and they knew that. And they may thought they had him now under their power. He's the one that's going to be in power. He's going to come in the judgment, and it's going to be like a cloudy day when that day comes. I'm thinking he's talking about the coming on judgment against them and against Jerusalem that would soon to happen, but that might not be. He could have been talking about that second coming, which is yet to come. But either way, he's going to be the one in power. It's going to be a cloudy day. Now, it's like when they heard this, they just lost their minds. They just went berserk. Look what the impartial, the high priest that is supposed to maintain an air of impartiality, then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Now behold, you've heard his blasphemy. There's no impartiality from the judge here, is there? And then, what think ye? They answered and said, he is guilty of death. Then did they spit in his face. Have you ever had anybody do that to you? To have such contempt for you that they'll just spit in your face? If anybody did that to me, I wouldn't like it. Sometimes we sing a song. Sometimes it causes me to tremble. Now, emotionally, I connect this with John 3:16. You might want to put in the margin here about John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Then did they spit in his face. Now Mark says that they covered his face. So they spat in his face and they covered his face. Luke says they blindfolded him, so he couldn't see what they were doing. And they buffeted him and smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ. Who is he that smote thee? You know, it's one thing to be prepared for a blow to the face or the head. What if you're blindfolded and you don't know where the blow's coming from or when it's coming? And they're doing that to him. And I know they did not even consider that it was he who had given them their spittle to moisten their lips when they used their lips to send their spittle into his face. It was he who had given them their hands that they'd be able to take care of themselves. when they used the palms of their hands to smite him, he gave them the breath that they used when they say unto him, mocking him, Thou Christ. And then they said, Who is he that smote thee? See, they didn't think he knew. But he knew. He knew. And there's going to come a day in which he's going to be the judge. And those that smote him are going to be the defendants. And they're going to know he knew. And they're going to learn something else. That he loves them yet. And if they've obeyed the gospel of Christ, they are going to be saved. Well, sometimes it causes me to tremble. And doesn't that tell you how beautiful this story is? And the depths of the love of God and that wonderful gospel. And see, that goes for you too. Regardless now of what you've done, you can obey the gospel of Jesus Christ and stand before him on that day and be saved. And so why not now? Why not now? If everyone's thinking about Christ in this world, though their thoughts may be shallow, these thoughts are deep. And this morning, you obey the gospel of Christ, you'll be ready for that day. And that's what makes this such a beautiful story. If you'll respond to the invitation, and do it as we stand and sing.